So we have completed the intertestamental period, connecting the Old Testament to the New Testament, historically speaking, and also having gone through the Apocrypha, we know some of the literary background in that time frame as well. We're shifting into the life of Jesus, which will take quite a few weeks to get through, especially because of the holiday breaks. So tonight we'll look at an overview of the New Testament and also the circumstances around the birth of Jesus. Next week we'll look at the ministry of John the Baptist, and on the 17th we'll look at how Jesus' ministry begins. And then we have Christmas break and New Year's break, and 7th of January is the Christmas party. I will be at a pastor and wives retreat, so I will not be present.
So we have a month of readings that are going to get...
Yep, month of readings.
That's a lot of chocolate.
It is a lot of chocolate that one night, you're right.
I might not go to bed for a while that night.
You could ration it a little bit through the week.
Could.
You could just splurge, you're right. So, tonight, the only two books that we're going to be looking at are parts of Matthew and Luke, with the birth of Jesus, because Mark kind of skips over that entirely, and John just didn't even get around to talking about it. So, Matthew and Luke. First, we will do an overview of the New Testament. All right. How many books do we have in the New Testament?
33.
39 is the Old Testament. 33 is the year Jesus got crucified. Do I have another number?
22.
Nope.
Wait, 39, 64, is it 25?
27. 27 books in the New Testament. Either 8 authors or 9 authors. The author of the book of Hebrews is uncertain. That's why it's either 8 or 9.
8 or 9, that's not that big.
These books get compiled and canonized officially by 323 AD of the Nicene Council, and are recognized as the New Testament scriptures. Now at this time, the status of the apocryphal books of the Old Testament are not fully worked out. They were sometimes later referred to as the second canon, so they had already established kind of a lesser status, but the New Testament books were determined at this point in time, and largely this was just ruling out which Greek New Testament era books were not going to be part of the New Testament. And there were a lot, because there's lots of gaps that the New Testament leaves that plenty of people thought that they should fill in, like the book of Acts is all about the Acts of Paul largely. So what about the Acts of the Apostle Peter, or the Acts of the Apostle Thomas, or the Acts of the Apostle Matthew? You can find one for every single one of them.
Really?
Yes. They're not historically accurate. Most of them were written centuries later, and you can tell because of the theology they're trying to justify by their book. So, one of them, I've read the first few verses of the Acts of the Apostle Peter, and he's going down to the city of Alexandria from Jerusalem, and he's met by an angel whose sole purpose is to declare him bishop over the entire church. Now, why do you suppose somebody would write about that?
To make claim that theirs is the correct church? Or theirs...
That he is the first pope.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't really even a thing or an idea for 400 or 500 years. So that book is easy to peg at a much later writing date because they're talking about issues and beliefs that nobody even cooked up back then. So anyhow, once these are canonized, we'll look at the details of them. Old Testament has 5 types of books. The New Testament has 4 types. We have our Gospels, we have our history book, we have lots of epistles, which is just a good Latin or Greek word for letters. And then we have the prophecy, or the apocalyptic vision of John. So our first books are the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all named after the author of the book.
What does the word gospel mean?
Gospel means good news. That is a good question because it is simply a Greek word transliterated into English. It's just
Greek?
good news. I'm pretty sure it's Greek. I don't think it's Latin.
So that's why Revelation's not a gospel?
Yes. That's the good news of the end of it all happening eventually, but no. They are all talking about the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection. So, 4 Gospels cover a historical time frame that stretches from 6 BC to 33 AD. Covers the birth of Christ, which we'll get to today, the ministry of Christ, and then his death and resurrection. You can break them down into 2 different groups. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are considered to be complementary Gospels because they cover much of the same information and complement one another, whereas the book of John is very different from the other 3 and is much more of a supplement to the first 3.
Could you explain why I give a brief example?
You'll understand that in a bit here.
Okay.
So, with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are similar enough to the point where there's all kinds of theories as to how they ended up becoming similar. One of them is that they were just simply written in the order that they are found in our New Testament. So Matthew wrote his first, Mark wrote his next, and Luke wrote his third. And that they just happen to be so similar because the Holy Spirit led them to do so. Second theory, looking at a literary analysis of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it would look like Mark was written first because Matthew and Luke both draw an awful lot of material out of Mark. But they don't seem to take all the same information, and they don't seem to have influenced each other's books at all, hardly. Now, some people would say, well, Mark was influenced more by Matthew, but it's really hard to explain how Luke ended up being similar to Mark in a lot of ways, but not similar to Matthew in as many other ways. So, the literary analysis would point towards Mark being written first, and then Matthew and Luke getting written afterwards, independent of each other, not with each other's known existence. Whichever one is true and actually happened really doesn't matter a whole lot. Just 2 different ways of explaining how they end up looking that way. We're going to jump back to Ezekiel, actually, because there's a really interesting prophecy in Ezekiel 1 that seems to point towards the Gospels. Anybody read Ezekiel 1?
Not recently.
Yeah, not recently. So Ezekiel has this amazing vision of the cherubim moving around under the throne of God. And so reading from verse 5 there, it says, "And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings." And jumping down to verse 10, it says, "As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle. And the front face was a human."
Where was the eagle?
Backside. So 4 sides to their head, 4 different faces.
That would be terrifying to come across.
Yes, 4 living creatures are quite something. And then I think they also have eyes all over the place. Yeah.
Oh, they were those ones.
Yep. Anyway, there are not too many things in the scriptures that appear in 4s, but the Gospels are one of them. And as it turns out, there is a pattern to the Gospels that follows this prophecy out of Ezekiel as well. And so I'll present that here. Matthew is oftentimes thought to be the face of a lion, presenting Jesus as the king. That's the Old Testament reference to Jesus. He's the Lion of Judah. Judah was the kingly tribe that the Davidic line of kings came from, and it's also the tribe that Jesus descends from. Now, 42% of the verses in the book of Matthew are unique to Matthew and are not found in the other 3 Gospels, which implies either 58% of verses are found in one of the other Gospels. And Matthew was writing very clearly to a Jewish audience. So more than any of the other Gospel writers, he's citing Old Testament prophecies that Jesus is fulfilling, one of which actually isn't even extant. In the birth of Jesus narrative, he talks about, or he makes reference to, that is why it's said that he will be called a Nazarene, and not aware of any Old Testament passage that refers to Jesus as a Nazarene. But he was, because he was from Nazareth. But one of the other things the Jews were looking for is they were expecting their Messiah to be a king, and Matthew puts a very heavy, strong emphasis on that aspect of Jesus. That's why he starts off with a genealogy running from David through the line of kings in Judah down to Jesus. Now compared to that, Mark is often compared to the face of the ox, presenting Jesus as a servant. Only 7% of the verses found in the book of Mark are unique. 93% of them are almost word-for-word copies found out of Matthew or Luke. This, from the literary analysis, was one of the driving forces to why they think that Mark was written first, because it has so little that ends up being unique to it. One of the fun challenges is reading through the book of Mark and trying to figure out what little snippets are unique to Mark and not found anywhere else. And there are just a handful of them here and there. One of them actually refers to Jesus' hometown being Capernaum. And another one is the parable of the growing seed, which comes right after the parable of the sower. And it's a little short parable. You won't find it in Matthew or Luke. It only landed in Mark. The audience of the book of Mark is often thought to be the Romans, because the Romans were a very practical and pragmatic culture, and Mark illustrates Jesus through his gospel as serving and doing. It's a very action-oriented gospel. It doesn't show Jesus sitting around pontificating as much as he is going here, going there, healing, teaching, and doing things as a man of action. So moving on, Luke is often showing Jesus as the Son of Man, and Luke is often thought to be the face of a man from the passage out of Ezekiel. Luke uses the term Son of Man far more than any of the other Gospels. It's interesting, it actually pulls this out of a prophecy in Daniel 7. This is one of those prophecies with lots of pronouns. It's not easy to figure out until you see the fulfillment of it. Somebody want to look up Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14? 7 verses 13 and 14.
I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is one that shall not be destroyed.
So that is a significant prophecy pointing towards Jesus, the coming ruler, and Jesus taking on the title of the Son of Man is not an insignificant statement. He's not belittling himself, calling himself just a human, nor is he trying to be, or showing himself to be in solidarity with all the people that he's talking to. He's actually laying claim to the fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy by referring to himself as the Son of Man. Now Luke has a few more unique verses than the book of Matthew. 59% of it is unique. That means 41% of it is also found in another gospel. Luke's audience is often thought to be the Greeks. The Greeks were humanists, exalted man as a chief of all creation, and Luke was very aware of that aspect of Greek culture when he was writing his book. Now, John was a supplementary gospel. The reason for that is 92% of it is unique. When John wrote his gospel, the other three were probably well written and in circulation, and John was aware of what was there, and his opinion of what needed to be said was all the stuff the other three guys missed. And so that is why so much of his gospel is unique. He actually emphasizes Jesus' relationship with his heavenly Father an awful lot, which is why it is often thought that John is presenting the face of an eagle in his presentation of Jesus. And he also emphasizes Jesus as the Son of God as one of the recurring themes.
I don't understand, why they represent different animals.
Yeah, 4 different faces of the cherubim. That's something to sit and meditate on for a long, long time. So there's 4 different presentations of who Jesus is in the New Testament. So this is just kind of connecting back to that Old Testament prophecy. But you can see there's actually thematic differences in the Gospels in the way they present who Jesus is, how he acts, and how he relates. And this is the way that it's typically correlated with those images out of the Old Testament. This is probably a sermon and an hour-long teaching in and of itself. I'm just going to inform you of it, and at some point someone else can give you a deeper version of that, or you can do some searching yourself. But that is a common connection I didn't want to omit from this. So John's gospel is oftentimes thought of as being written to the entire world. Of course, in his gospel is the most famous verse of all time. And what does it say? For God so loved the world. Not for God so loved the Romans, for God so loved the Greeks. His emphasis is on the world. Jesus came to save the world. And it's got much less of a cultural affinity to any of those other people groups. He is not catering to the Jews or the Greeks or the Romans. He is just giving a broad swath. So those are the 4 Gospels. Lots of good Kahoot questions in that. Moving on, there is one good book of history in the New Testament, and it is the book of Acts. Historical time frame of the book of Acts is 33 to roughly 62 AD. I might modify that second number by the end of our survey here because I haven't run through all of my New Testament history sources to get a clear end date on Acts chapter 28. 62-ish, plus or minus a few years possibly. It was written by Luke, the same guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, and it has a few different sections to it. Records the history of the early church, particularly in Jerusalem, but also how it gets out all the way to Antioch. And then Luke was one of the companions of Paul during his ministry, and so one of the parts of church history that Luke was the most familiar with was Paul's ministry and his trips. So that is one of the major emphases of the book of Acts. But through the course of it, we see a model for the church today, and we'll look at that some when we get there. So then we move into epistles, which cover almost all the rest of the books of the New Testament. But I don't even know if that amounts to half of the chapters of the New Testament, honestly, because many of them are very short. So, as mentioned earlier, epistles are letters. They're written by apostles to either churches, individuals, or groups of believers. They typically include a greeting at the beginning of it. The various doctrines they address, oftentimes critical analysis of their books will try to figure out what false teaching were they trying to deal with in the writing of this book. And you can actually find some of the themes of what false teachings were circulating around the early churches that the apostles were writing and addressing in their letters. There'll be encouragements, there'll be some corrections, and then they usually end it with benedictions of some sort. And that is just a general pattern. There's lots of unique aspects and variations to them. So the epistles usually get further divided into two groups. You'll have your Pauline epistles. Those are epistles that were written by the Apostle Paul, which can further be subdivided into books or letters written to churches, which include Romans through 2nd Thessalonians, and then 4 more letters that he wrote to individuals, Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. They have a difference in them, for sure. So the other group of epistles are the general epistles, and this includes Hebrews through Jude. Hebrews might be a Pauline epistle. It doesn't have an author attributed to it in the book. The only thing we know about the author is that it's somebody who knew Timothy, because it made reference to Timothy having been released from prison. It is possible it is also Barnabas. There is an early church leader by the name of Tertullian, I think that was that one, or somebody else in that neighborhood, that attributed the book of Hebrews to Barnabas specifically. The literary analysis isn't really conclusive, but if you compare the book of Hebrews to all of the other epistles that were written by Paul, there's enormous differences in style and scope. However, Hebrews was written to the Jews, the Hebrews, not to Greeks, which would be all the other letters that he was writing. So it could just be, some people explain the style difference as just simply being Paul talking to his countrymen instead of foreigners. But one of the interesting literary analyses that has looked at the New Testament books is they have discovered that regardless of the length of writing, and people use certain words with certain frequencies and per word, and so you can actually get a scope of how large of a vocabulary an author has just simply by comparing lots of their different writings, and they'll usually have a similar curve. So common words will get used really frequently, and less common words will only get used once or twice. And somebody did an analysis of Shakespeare on this, and they figured out that he had a working vocabulary of about 500,000 English words, whereas the average high schooler has a working English vocabulary of about 10,000.
10,000?
So, yeah, 10,000.
That's still a lot of words.
It is a lot of words.
500,000 is a lot more.
500,000 is a lot more words. Anyway, so somebody realized that this tool could be used to analyze ancient writings to determine the likelihood of it being the same author or a different author based on their word count. Because there's all kinds of ancient writings that are attributed to somebody, but it turns out it's actually just somebody fabricating it to make it look like it was written by somebody when it wasn't. So they did this analysis with Hebrews, and Hebrews ended up having a very different curve, a very different set of words and such. And so that analysis, which is obviously just a modern literary analysis, would point towards Hebrews being written by somebody other than Paul, not necessarily Barnabas. We don't know of anything that Barnabas wrote to compare it to, but that would point towards it being a different author. So I included it with the general epistles. James was written by James, not the James the Apostle, but James the half-brother of Jesus. The 2 Peters were written by Peter, one of the 12, Simon Peter, and the first 3 John epistles are the same John who wrote the Gospel of John and also the Revelation of John. Jude is also another brother of Jesus. And those all have the author attributed right in the epistle, so it's a lot more clear. When we get to that phase of the New Testament survey, we'll dig into all of those a lot deeper. Brings us to our last book, the apocalyptic prophetic vision of the Revelation. This comes aptly at the very end of the New Testament because it is presumed to be the last book of the New Testament written, actually. It was given to John at the very end of his life. He was in exile on the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea when he received it, and he wrote it as a letter to 7 churches in Asia that he had had an apostolic relationship with at some point earlier in his ministry, one of which included Ephesus, actually. And the book of Revelation ends up connecting very well and very closely to lots of other apocalyptic passages, like the ones found in Ezekiel and Daniel, and Jesus' comments in Matthew 24 and 25, and Paul's writings in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Gives us a little better picture of what is to come, and still very mysterious and cryptic, and leaves us wanting. So, any questions on the books of the New Testament? Lots of good Kahoot questions in there. So we'll move on to the birth of Jesus. It's that time of year, so it's great. All right, so the timing of the birth of Jesus is more controversial than you would ever imagine.
James Usher.
I'm sorry, what?
James Usher.
No, even more controversial than that.
Alright.
So I'll point this out. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king." So who's on the throne in Judea?
Herod.
Herod the Great. And he came to power after the Romans appointed him in 40 BC. In Luke chapter 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria." So we now have the birth of Jesus attached to the reigns of two different kings,
Oh boy.
Quirinius and Herod the Great. And wouldn't you know it, but they don't overlap. Herod the Great was king of Judah until he dies under questionable circumstances somewhere in March or April of 4 BC, and that's not really in question. Quirinius does not become governor of that province of Syria until 6 AD, so there's a 9-year gap because there is no zero, and that has been the source of much spilled ink. So there's two possible solutions, either one of which could work, or they could both be true to an extent. I'll explain that to you here. In the book of Acts, and who wrote the book of Acts?
Luke.
Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, which referenced the census in the days of Quirinius. So Luke, writing in Acts, is actually quoting Gamaliel, one of the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin at this point in time. But Gamaliel, in his long soliloquy, says, "After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered." That happened in a census that Quirinius was in charge of in 6 and 7 AD. That's well documented, and the Jews all know that. The reason for that is kind of funny because the Jews were always rising up to rebel about something. And this actually is what triggered the Zealots to actually form as a group, was this census. Because it was contrary to the law of Moses for kings to conduct a census to determine how many fighting men there could possibly be. Remember how it went with David when he tried doing that?
Yeah, not well.
Not good. So the Jews were just appalled that the Romans were trying to conduct a census. And so they rose up in rebellion. And that's what Gamaliel is referencing here. Well, Luke knew about that. But in Luke 2, verses 1 and 2, he says, "In those days, decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria." What do you notice by the when?
It's got a footnote.
It's got a footnote. You want to dig out the footnote, Micaiah?
Sure. You're talking Luke 2.
Luke 2, 1 and 2.
Right. Or this was the registration before.
Right. So this could have been a registration before Quirinius was governor of Syria. And that actually grammatically works out with the way the Greek sentence is structured there. It is a plausible interpretation of that. The other possible solution for this, one of the interesting things though, is that passage in Luke 2 implies that there was more than one census. And so there's one that's well documented in other historical writings, but Luke implies there was more than one census, because if there was a first census, there was also a second one. He doesn't say which one he's referring to necessarily. But second possible solution is, was Quirinius governor in effect over Syria even though he wasn't officially a Roman governor. And the reason they talk about this as being a possible solution, and this is the solution that James Ussher leans into, is because Quirinius was ruling the Eastern Roman Empire almost like a vice emperor in the name of Augustus Caesar. And that lasted from 12 until 1 BC. And it is not unlikely that he was trying to get a census conducted in that neighborhood at the time. And that would have spilled over into Judea, the domain of Herod the Great, because it was a very close Roman protectorate and ally, even if it wasn't officially part of the Roman Empire just yet. The weakness of this potential solution is that it is more circumstantial and conjecture in nature. There is not a stronger argument in favor of it. So, in any case, this both would point towards Jesus being born before Herod the Great dies in 4 BC. So the events as described start in the summer or fall of 6 BC, when an angel appears to Zechariah, who is serving as a priest in the temple, and his wife Elizabeth conceives after the angel speaks to him and then causes him to go mute for a season. We know the timing of this because Elizabeth is in her 6th month when Mary goes and visits her. Did you have a question? No? Okay.
Sorry.
Just checking. So 6 months later, after Elizabeth is conceived, the angel appears to Mary and declares that she is going to have a child, even though she hasn't been with a man, and the angel gives her a sign. Elizabeth, her cousin, is in her 6th month. And so you know why Mary skedaddled to go find Elizabeth, because that's the way you verify an angel actually spoke to you, is if what the angel said you'd find, it actually happens to be there. John the Baptist gets born, and this is probably in June of 5 BC. That's just because it's 6 months before Jesus would have been born. And then Jesus would have been born in December of 5 BC. This happens to be the 4,000th year of the world since it was created. So the world gets created in 4004 BC in fall. Jesus is born late fall, presumably in the neighborhood of December 25th, but that's another issue in and of itself. And the Temple of Solomon, if you remember, was built and dedicated on the 3,000th year of the history of the world.
What happened on the 2000th year? Was the world destroyed?
Nope, the world was not destroyed. That's not too far away from when Abraham was born, but it was a little before Abraham was born.
Wait, when was the 6,000?
1996.
Oh my.
Yes, that's the year I met Neil Tilke. So obviously that was significant. Neil Tilke was the pastor mentor of mine, so yep, went to Siberia, met him over there.
You met him in Siberia?
I met him in Siberia for the first time.
Not even over
Not
here?
even over here, no.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yep, I lived in Northfield, Minnesota. He lived in Morris, Minnesota, and we had to travel all the way to 12 time zones away to the far side of the earth and meet in Siberia. So, all right, continuing on through the events of Jesus' birth. On the 8th day, he's circumcised and he's given the name Jesus. On the 40th day, he's presented in the temple, and that's when Simeon and the prophetess, I believe her name was Anna? Yeah. Both say things about him. At some point in this time frame, Magi come from the east and visit Mary and Joseph. Then Mary and Joseph skedaddle and flee down to Egypt. And Herod the Great dies just a couple months later. So they actually were not down in Egypt a particularly long time. Archelaus becomes king, and when Mary and Joseph hear of that, they return, but they don't stick around in Bethlehem. They head up north to Galilee to be a little further away from the center of power, because when your son is been called the King of the Jews and the Messiah and all the prophetic words, you don't want to be close to those who might take offense at that. So they return to Nazareth. And use this map last week, but zooming in here, you notice the political situation of the Roman Empire had not fully solved yet. And so one of the reasons why Mary and Joseph end up fleeing down to Egypt is because they're crossing a border outside of which Herod the Great no longer has power. Because even though Herod the Great was closely aligned with the Roman Empire, it was not part of the Roman Empire yet. That didn't happen until 6 AD, when Quirinius moves onto the scene more aggressively. And Archelaus actually was king until 6 AD, and that's when the Romans just decide we're going to make Judea a province instead of an allied kingdom of ours. So that's why Mary and Joseph head down to Egypt, and then they can return later. But it was safe in Egypt because no one would go hunting for him there. Any questions about the birth of Jesus?
Oh wait, actually.
Yeah.
Where did the Magi come from?
Magi, good question.
They came from the east.
Yep, they came from the
Vague.
east. Very vague, isn't it? So the Magi are actually Persian sorcerers and magicians. So it's an interesting phenomena because we oftentimes think of them coming from the east, and when we think east, we think like China east. They didn't come from China east, not even India east.
You think of China?
What?
You think of China?
I think of China when I think of the east.
Oh, when I think of them coming from the east, I think of like Persia.
Uh-huh. Persia's the right thing to think. That's what I've been directing you towards your entire life so far.
It's
So
probably because of the
yeah. Yeah, no, so the Magi were Persian guys. They're known as wise men, but they were the people that Daniel was put in charge of 600 years earlier. He was the chief of the magicians, the enchanters, all those other people. And so their appearance actually in the midst of this is one of the great mysteries, is why do these Persian guys associate a star with the King of the Jews being born? And that's an Old Testament prophecy that's not extant. Like, why is that? But we know that Daniel would have had some influence over them, and it could be that he planted that seed and said, we're looking for this sign, and this is going to come, and this is what it's going to mean. But they saw something in the heavens, and that's how they interpreted it, and it interpreted correctly, because when they got over there, they found him, just as they were expecting.
So they notify him of danger, or like know how to find him?
No, they didn't. They went to Jerusalem, remember?
Oh yeah.
Because you go to Jerusalem where the king is to find out who was born king of the Jews. That's why it
And Herod's
caused
like,
all
oh.
kinds of stir, because Herod's like, ain't nobody been born recently here, king of the Jews, but I'm really curious to find out who you think was, because that one won't be around any longer. So, yep, all of Jerusalem was troubled with him, because that just gives the king a reason for a purge, and then any perceived enemy could be eliminated for cause. But yeah, the priests then know that the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem, and so that's why they send him over to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And then they just noticed the stars stopped over the place the house where he was.
How does the star like stop over the place where he was? That's the
Yeah,
other thing. Like,
How does that work?
how does that work?
So the star is another one of the mysteries of the story. What in the world was it that they saw? Because some parts of it seem to imply that the star was moving, and it would be more like an upper atmosphere phenomena, something that can like move around in the sky and point this direction or that direction. But common sense and just understanding what a star is would make it seem like it's something that's out in the heavens.
Could have been a supernova.
Could have been a supernova. Yep,
That would have been cool.
that would have been really cool.
Tubi movie says that it is the
Conjunction between Jupiter and Venus.
correct.
Yep,
Yeah,
and there were
that's-
many conjunctions in those days that have been noted, because you can rewind the solar clock and find out what planets would have been where in the sky, and there was a conjunction between Venus and Jupiter in that time frame that would have made it look like a single really bright star. And I think it would have been in the western sky, so Magi would have been drawn to move towards the west. Nobody knows exactly which conjunction it was, and it might have been one in 6 BC, because Herod killed off everybody who was 2 years younger, so it could be one that they saw quite a bit earlier, or it could have been another one.
So Jesus could have been 9 years old when that happened.
No, how did you come up with that?
That was
wait,
6 BC, not
6
AD.
BC, not AD. My bad.
Yep. 6 BC would be when John the Baptist was born.
Yeah,
They may have seen the star that far back.
they have to track.
travel. And that's a good 3 months on camel, maybe 4, 100 days or better. It was a very dedicated journey, to say the least.
Is the purpose of that just to give the monetary funds for Joseph and Mary to flee to Egypt?
That was definitely one of the benefits of that, is Joseph and Mary had a whole pile of wealth suddenly, then made it very easy to go to Egypt and not have to earn a living in a foreign land, because you got just trade and sell, and they can also get back without any difficulty either. But there's symbolic value to the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh.
Yeah.
Gold because he's a king, frankincense and myrrh is like anointing him before he's even going to be crucified. Those are the spices that the women would have used most likely to embalm him. So, good questions. Any other questions on the birth of Jesus? All right. Well, with that, we'll end a little bit early tonight, and I'll prepare more material next week. So we might get past John the Baptist. He does not have too many chapters in